October 27th, 1962. White House Situation Room. It's tense, razor tense. The kind of tension that makes your skin prickle and your mouth go dry. The air is stale from cigarette smoke and too many men breathing the same recycled air for too many hours. The overhead lights cast a harsh, clinical glow that deepens the shadows beneath tired eyes. Somewhere in the building, a clock ticks away seconds that feel increasingly precious. Inside the windowless room, crowded with maps and intelligence reports, a young naval intelligence analyst named David Ryder stares at surveillance photographs spread across the wooden table. His finger traces the unmistakable outlines of Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles, their launch erectors pointed skyward like accusatory fingers. The photos aren't facing the usual direction. They're arranged in what the team calls countdown configuration, showing a clear deployment sequence from construction to operational status. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara glances at Ryder sideways and mutters, "You're still convinced they're fully operational?" David doesn't answer immediately. His throat feels tight. His finger taps a shadow on one of the photographs. He's been analyzing these images for days while the world teeters on the edge of nuclear annihilation. "Yes, sir," he finally says. "These missiles could launch within hours of receiving the order." Then across the room, a communications officer bursts through the door. "Flash message from the USS Beale, sir. They've detected a Soviet submarine and are dropping signaling depth charges." The room goes silent. President Kennedy, who has been quietly conferring with his brother Robert in the corner, looks up sharply. "They're dropping depth charges on a Russian submarine?" "Signaling charges, Mr. President," someone clarifies. "Standard procedure to force them to surface." Kennedy's face remains impassive, but his knuckles whiten around the folder he's holding. What if they don't understand it's signaling? What if they think they're under attack? David Ryder knows what no one else in the room has put together yet. His analysis from yesterday, buried in a stack of intelligence summaries, had concluded that these submarines were likely carrying nuclear torpedoes. If the submarine commander believes he's under attack, because this isn't just another Cold War confrontation. This is the moment when miscalculation could trigger the launch of nearly 100 nuclear missiles from Cuban soil against American cities. This is what happens when a world superpower discovers another world superpower has secretly placed nuclear weapons 90 miles from American shores, and neither side knows how to back down without appearing weak. They called it the Cuban Missile Crisis. But for 13 days in October 1962, it was simply hour after hour of men staring into the abyss, wondering if each decision would be the one that ended human civilization. And for David Ryder, the analyst no one expected to make a difference, these 13 days would reveal that sometimes the most crucial player in a nuclear standoff isn't the one with his finger on the button, but the one who interprets the enemy's intent. Before he became the man who helped navigate the most dangerous confrontation of the nuclear age, David Ryder was just another bright young man from Massachusetts with a knack for details. He wasn't imposing. He wasn't particularly charismatic. He grew up poring over maps and photographs, fascinated by the stories they told. His father worked in commercial printing. His mother taught high school history. After graduating from Boston University with honors, David joined Naval Intelligence because it seemed like a place where precision mattered. He never imagined he would end up analyzing photographs that might determine whether millions lived or died. David trained at the Naval Intelligence School in Washington, where he was assigned to photo reconnaissance analysis. His instructors noted his methodical approach, his eye for subtle patterns, and his ability to see relationships between seemingly unrelated details. While others looked for obvious military installations, David studied infrastructure changes, new roads, power lines, unusual construction patterns. Where others relied on established analytical models, David developed his own systematic approach that integrated multiple intelligence sources. He was innovative but not flashy, thorough, not hasty. Still, no one particularly noticed him. He wasn't the fastest. He wasn't the loudest. In a Cold War intelligence community where assertive personalities often dominated briefings, David remained in the background until October 1962. By the time the first U-2 spy plane photographs of missile sites in Cuba landed on his desk on October 15th, the Cold War had hardened into a dangerous stalemate. The Soviet Union under Premier Khrushchev was pushing to assert itself globally. The United States under President Kennedy was determined to maintain its nuclear superiority and hemispheric dominance. But now came the ultimate test: Soviet nuclear missiles being installed just 90 miles from American shores, capable of hitting Washington, D.C. in under 30 minutes. That's where David Ryder's analytical skills came into play. The U-2 photographs were high resolution but ambiguous to untrained eyes. Concrete pads in the Cuban countryside, construction equipment, unusual security patterns. Most analysts focused on confirming the presence of missiles. David went further. He studied the construction sequences, compared them to known Soviet missile deployment protocols from bases in Eastern Europe, and developed a timeline for when each installation would become operational. He noticed details others missed: the positioning of fuel tankers, the specific arrangement of security perimeters, the presence of specialized communication equipment. David calculated not just where the missiles were, but how long until they could launch, their likely targets based on positioning, and most crucially, which sites would become operational first. His assessments were more conservative than some analysts who wanted definitive conclusions immediately, but more specific than those who hedged every statement with qualifications. After 2 days of intense analysis, David prepared a preliminary report that departed from the consensus view. While others suggested the missiles might become operational sometime in the next few weeks, David's analysis indicated some sites were much closer, perhaps days away from being fully functional. His report included a detailed sequence: which sites would be ready first, which would follow, and how the deployment pattern suggested an accelerated timetable compared to standard Soviet protocols. But David's report arrived during chaos. President Kennedy had been informed of the missiles on October 16th. The Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ExComm, had been hastily assembled to develop response options. Military leaders pushed for immediate airstrikes to destroy the missiles. State Department officials advocated diplomatic approaches. The pressure to act quickly battled against the need to act wisely. David's report, with its careful sequencing and conservative time estimates, initially got lost in the shuffle. It didn't provide the absolute certainty some wanted. It didn't support either the bomb immediately faction or the wait and see contingent. Instead, it offered something more nuanced, a structured understanding of how the threat was evolving day by day. On the morning of October 18th, as ExComm debated response options, CIA Director John McCone referenced a dissenting analysis that suggested a more methodical approach might be necessary. That analysis was David's. He found himself unexpectedly summoned to provide clarification. Walking into that room filled with the most powerful men in America was the most intimidating moment of David's life. His mouth went dry as he approached the table. Secretary of Defense McNamara looked impatient. "You're the analyst who thinks these installations are following a specific deployment sequence." "Yes, sir," David replied, his voice steadier than he felt. He pulled out his folder of annotated photographs. "If I may," he laid them out in chronological order, showing how the construction at each site followed specific patterns. The Soviets aren't deploying these missiles randomly. They're following a protocol that prioritizes certain locations based on strategic value and defensibility. "And your conclusion?" President Kennedy asked from the head of the table. "The missiles near San Cristobal will be operational first, within 3 to 5 days based on current progress. The sites near Sagua La Grande will follow approximately 48 hours later. The remaining sites will come online in sequence over the following week." David paused, then added the critical insight. "They're establishing a staggered deployment to ensure that even if we strike, some missiles will remain operational." The room went quiet. David had just articulated what many feared, but none had precisely mapped. The Soviets were creating a doomsday insurance policy. Even a successful American first strike might not eliminate all the missiles before they could launch. Secretary of State Dean Rusk leaned forward. "How certain are you of this timetable?" "I've compared these deployments to 17 documented Soviet missile installations in Eastern Europe," David explained. "While they've accelerated certain phases, the sequence remains consistent. I'd place confidence at 85% for the timing, 95% for the sequence." That level of specificity, backed by methodical analysis rather than gut feeling, caught Kennedy's attention. "This changes our decision timeline," the president noted. "If we're going to act militarily, we need to do so before the first missiles become operational." David's analysis didn't determine the eventual American response, a naval blockade rather than immediate airstrikes, but it helped shape the understanding of how much time they had to act. His sequenced approach to the missile deployments gave the administration a critical roadmap of the developing threat. As he was dismissed from the meeting, McNamara stopped him. "Good work, Ryder. Keep updating that sequence as new imagery comes in. I want daily reports on which sites are advancing fastest." David nodded, simultaneously terrified and oddly energized. His analytical approach, methodical, sequenced, focused on patterns rather than individual data points, had provided something the administration desperately needed: a structured understanding of how the crisis was unfolding. He walked back to his desk, thinking about the weight of what had just happened. Lives, potentially millions of them, might hinge on the accuracy of his analysis. It wasn't a comfortable thought, but in that moment he understood that this crisis would be navigated one careful assessment at a time. And somehow, his particular way of seeing patterns had suddenly become vital. Over the next 48 hours, David barely left his office. U-2 flights were bringing back new imagery several times daily. Each new photograph required integration into his evolving understanding of the Soviet deployment sequence. Some sites were progressing faster than anticipated. Others seemed to have stalled. By October 20th, as President Kennedy prepared to address the nation and announce the naval quarantine of Cuba, David had refined his analysis further. The missiles at San Cristobal were progressing more rapidly than initially estimated. They would likely be operational within 72 hours. The sequence remained as predicted, but the timeline was compressing. When he submitted this update, he received an unexpected phone call from McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor. "Ryder, the President is reviewing your latest assessment. He wants to know, if we implement the blockade rather than airstrikes, Will it stop these missiles from becoming operational? David considered carefully. No, sir. The equipment for making the existing missile sites operational is already in Cuba. The blockade will prevent additional missiles from arriving, but it won't stop the completion of sites already under construction. There was a long pause. That's what we were afraid of. Keep monitoring. The president needs to know the moment any site becomes fully operational. The blockade was announced on October 22nd. Kennedy addressed the nation, revealing the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba and declaring the naval quarantine. The world held its breath. Soviet ships approached the blockade line. U.S. forces went to DEFCON 3, then DEFCON 2, the highest alert level ever in American history. And through it all, David Ryder tracked the relentless progress of missile sites across Cuba. His analysis now included estimates of launch preparation times once operational, potential targeting packages based on missile positioning, and continuously updated timelines for each site. On October 24th, as Soviet ships approached the blockade line, David noticed something unexpected in new reconnaissance photographs. Activity at several missile sites had slowed. Construction equipment that had been operating continuously now appeared stationary. Some personnel concentrations had dispersed. While other analysts focused on the drama of the approaching ships, David was watching the missile sites themselves. Something had changed. He prepared an urgent update. Evidence suggests deliberate deceleration of deployment activities at multiple sites, pattern consistent with strategic pause rather than technical delays. This assessment reached the XCOM just as news arrived that some Soviet ships had stopped or turned around before reaching the blockade. The two pieces of information together suggested Khrushchev might be reconsidering his approach. It was the first tiny glimmer of hope. David's role expanded as the crisis intensified. What had begun as technical analysis of missile deployment patterns evolved into something more comprehensive. He started tracking Soviet communications patterns, movements of personnel, changes in security protocols, anything that might indicate Soviet intentions. On October 26th, 11 days into the crisis, with the world still poised on the edge of nuclear war, David received a new batch of reconnaissance photographs. These showed something alarming: acceleration of activity at the most advanced missile sites near San Cristobal. While work had slowed at some locations, it had intensified at others. Most concerning, the activities suggested final launch preparations rather than continued construction. David rushed his analysis to McNamara personally. "Sir, the pattern has changed again. They're prioritizing completion of the most advanced sites while slowing work elsewhere. This suggests they're preparing a limited operational capability, perhaps as a bargaining position or as a hedge against attack." McNamara studied the report grimly. How soon? The San Cristobal site could be fully operational within 24 hours, 2 more sites within 48 hours after that. This assessment reached Kennedy just as a letter arrived from Khrushchev, suggesting a potential diplomatic solution. The Soviets would remove their missiles if the U.S. pledged not to invade Cuba. It seemed promising, until a second, more hardline message arrived the following day, demanding removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey as well. The conflicting messages created confusion. Which represented Khrushchev's real position? Was this a deliberate ploy to gain time while missiles became operational? David's analysis of site activities became crucial in determining how much time remained for diplomacy. As XCOM debated how to respond to Khrushchev's contradictory messages, David provided an urgent update. Activity at San Cristobal site indicates final operational checks. Site likely now capable of limited launch operations. Estimate 6 to 8 hour minimum preparation time required for actual launch. The first missiles were now operational, exactly as David had predicted in his initial sequencing analysis. The theoretical threat had become real. Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba could now potentially launch against American cities. That same day, October 27th, a U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot. Another U-2 accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace. Soviet submarine B-59 was forced to surface by U.S. naval forces, a submarine that, unknown to the Americans at the time, carried a nuclear torpedo and had nearly launched it. It was the most dangerous day of the crisis, the day history would later call Black Saturday. And it began with David Ryder's confirmation that Soviet missiles in Cuba were now operational, capable of killing millions of Americans within minutes of launch. Inside the Situation Room, as news of the U-2 shoot-down arrived, David observed the faces of America's leaders. The strain of 13 days on the brink of nuclear war showed in their eyes, the tight lines around their mouths, the way hands trembled slightly when reaching for coffee cups or cigarettes. What struck David most was how quiet the room became. There were no raised voices, no dramatic table pounding, just the low, intense murmur of men contemplating decisions that might end human civilization. President Kennedy, looking exhausted, convened a smaller group, including his brother Robert, Secretary of State Rusk, and McNamara. "We need to know what's happening at those missile sites right now," Kennedy said. "Are they preparing for launch?" All eyes turned to David, who suddenly found himself the center of attention in a way he'd never anticipated. He cleared his throat. The latest imagery shows increased personnel at the command vehicles, but no signs of immediate launch preparation. They're operational, but not yet in countdown configuration. "What would countdown configuration look like?" Robert Kennedy asked. David hesitated, then answered with precision. Additional fuel vehicles would appear. Personnel would clear a specific radius around the missiles. Launch command vehicles would be positioned differently. He paused. "We would see it, sir. They're not there yet." His certainty, backed by meticulous analysis rather than bravado, seemed to steady the room slightly. President Kennedy nodded. "So we still have time for diplomacy to work." In that moment, David realized something profound. His role wasn't just to track missile deployment sequences. It was to provide the precision these men needed to navigate between aggression and capitulation, to find the narrow path that might lead away from nuclear war. As the crisis reached its climax, with military forces at maximum alert and diplomatic channels working desperately to find a solution, David maintained his methodical approach. New reconnaissance photographs arrived hourly. Each one required careful comparison to previous images. Changes in personnel patterns, equipment positioning, security configurations, all might indicate Soviet intentions. Late that night, as Kennedy and his advisors formulated a response to Khrushchev's messages that would accept the first offer while ignoring the second, David noticed something significant. Activity at the missile sites had plateaued. There was no further progress toward launch preparation. In fact, at some locations, equipment was being repositioned in ways inconsistent with imminent launch. He prepared an urgent update. Evidence suggests holding pattern at all monitored sites. No progression toward launch configuration. Possible indication of awaiting further orders. This assessment reached the president as he reviewed the diplomatic message that would be sent to Khrushchev. It confirmed what Kennedy hoped, that despite the shoot-down of the U-2 and the confrontation at sea, the Soviets were not yet taking the final steps toward nuclear launch. There was still a window for diplomacy. The following morning, October 28th, brought the breakthrough. Khrushchev announced by public radio broadcast that the Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island. The crisis had ended, not with nuclear fire, but with mutual concessions that allowed both sides to step back from the brink. In the aftermath, as Soviet personnel began dismantling the missile sites under UN supervision, David's analytical approach was validated in an unexpected way. The disassembly sequence precisely matched the reverse of his predicted deployment sequence. The Soviets were breaking down the sites in exactly the order he had anticipated they would become fully operational. McNamara noticed this correlation and called David to his office. "Your sequencing model was remarkably accurate," he said. "How did you determine it?" David explained his methodology, how he had integrated known Soviet protocols with observable patterns in the reconnaissance imagery, creating a predictive model that identified not just current status, but future progression. The key was looking at the relationship between different elements rather than analyzing each site in isolation. McNamara studied him for a long moment. That approach probably gave us the time we needed to find a diplomatic solution. If we'd struck immediately, as some wanted, it could have triggered exactly what we were trying to prevent. It was as close to praise as the defense secretary ever offered. David nodded, simultaneously exhausted and relieved. The weight of the past 13 days, the knowledge that his assessments had influenced decisions that could have ended in nuclear war, was only now fully registering. As he walked back to his office, David reflected on what had happened. The crisis had been navigated not through bold, dramatic actions, but through careful, precise understanding of exactly where the boundaries lay. His contribution hadn't been heroic in the conventional sense. He'd fired no weapons, made no stirring speeches. He'd simply provided clarity when it was most desperately needed. In the weeks that followed, as the world gradually stepped back from the nuclear precipice, David's analytical methodology became a template for monitoring Soviet military activities. His sequenced approach, identifying patterns and relationships rather than isolated data points, was incorporated into standard intelligence protocols. The Air Force Photo Intelligence Unit adopted what they informally called the Rider method, a systematic approach to analyzing deployment sequences that provided not just current status, but predictive timelines. Intelligence briefings began, including sequenced assessments alongside traditional analysis. David himself remained largely in the background. Unlike some who had been involved in the crisis, he didn't seek publicity or advancement. He continued refining his analytical approach, applying it to other Soviet military activities in Eastern Europe and beyond. By January 1963, as the immediate aftermath of the crisis faded and new challenges emerged, David was asked to brief a group of intelligence officers on his methodology. Standing before them, he emphasized the core insight that had proven so valuable. We tend to analyze static snapshots, what exists at a single moment in time. But our adversaries think in sequences, what happens first, second, third. When we map their sequences rather than just their current position, we can anticipate their moves instead of merely reacting to them. This perspective, that understanding patterns of behavior was as important as identifying capabilities, represented a subtle but significant shift in intelligence analysis. It wasn't flashy, but it was effective. And in a Cold War that would continue for decades, effectiveness mattered more than flash. In March 1963, as the last Soviet missiles were confirmed removed from Cuba, David received a confidential letter of commendation from the Secretary of the Navy. It acknowledged his crucial contribution to national security during a period of unprecedented danger. The letter concluded with words that David found both gratifying and sobering. Your methodical analysis provided decision-makers with the precise understanding required to navigate between inadequate and excessive response. In doing so, you helped prevent miscalculation that could have led to catastrophic consequences. The letter was classified. No public recognition would follow. But for David, external recognition had never been the point. What mattered was knowing that when faced with the ultimate test, a direct nuclear confrontation between superpowers, his particular way of seeing patterns had helped find a path through. By the summer of 1963, as Kennedy and Khrushchev established a direct communications link, the famous hotline, to prevent future misunderstandings, David's approach had become part of standard intelligence methodology. Analysts were now trained to identify deployment sequences, to recognize patterns across multiple sites rather than focusing on individual locations, to think in terms of evolving capabilities rather than static threats. David continued his work, moving between assignments that utilized his particular skills. He analyzed Soviet missile deployments in Eastern Europe, tracked nuclear submarine patrols, assessed air defense system upgrades. Each analysis maintained the methodical, sequenced approach that had proven so valuable during those 13 days in October. What changed was how his assessments were received. Before the missile crisis, David had been just another analyst producing reports that might or might not be read carefully. After October 1962, his assessments went directly to senior officials. His sequenced analysis became a critical component of national security planning. In October 1963, on the first anniversary of the crisis, David was invited to a small, private gathering of those who had been in the Situation Room during those 13 days. No press, no formal statements, just a quiet acknowledgement among those who understood how close the world had come to destruction. President Kennedy moved through the room, speaking briefly with each person. When he reached David, he paused. "Ryder, right? The analyst who tracked the deployment sequence." "Yes, Mr. President." Kennedy nodded. "Your work gave us the time we needed. In a crisis like that, accurate information isn't just helpful. It's the difference between disaster and survival." It was a brief exchange, but it stayed with David long after. The president had articulated something fundamental. In the nuclear age, precision mattered more than ever before. The margin between peace and annihilation could be measured in hours, even minutes. Knowing exactly where that line lay could make all the difference. By 1964, after Kennedy's assassination, and with Lyndon Johnson in the White House, the lessons of the missile crisis began to be institutionalized. The National Photographic Interpretation Center, where David had analyzed those crucial U-2 images, expanded its capabilities. New protocols were established for tracking Soviet military deployments, with particular emphasis on the sequenced approach David had pioneered. David's career advanced steadily, if not spectacularly. He moved into a senior analytical role focused on Soviet strategic capabilities. His assessments informed arms control negotiations, force posture decisions, and crisis response planning. He trained younger analysts in his methodology, emphasizing the importance of seeing patterns across time rather than focusing solely on current status. What struck many who worked with him was how little the missile crisis seemed to have changed him personally. While some who had been involved developed a certain swagger, a sense of having faced the ultimate test and survived, David remained the same methodical, detail-oriented analyst he had always been. When asked about his role during those 13 days, he typically deflected, saying only that he had been part of a team that provided the best information possible under difficult circumstances. The understatement was characteristic of the man, but understated the impact of his work. In October 1967, on the 5th anniversary of the crisis, a young CIA analyst named Marcus Winters sought David out. Winters was working on a classified retrospective analysis of the crisis, examining what lessons could still be applied to current challenges. "Everyone I interview mentions your sequencing methodology," Winters said. "But what I can't quite grasp is how you developed it in the first place. It wasn't standard protocol at the time." David considered the question carefully. "I grew up studying maps," he finally said. "Not just where things were located, but how they related to each other. A river shapes where towns develop. Mountains determine where roads go. Everything follows patterns if you learn to see them." He paused. "The Soviets were deploying those missiles according to a logic. Their logic. I just tried to understand what that logic dictated would happen next." This ability to see patterns where others saw only isolated data points, to understand the logic behind an adversary's actions, became increasingly valued as the Cold War evolved. As Soviet nuclear capabilities expanded and new crises emerged, David's approach provided a framework for understanding not just what was happening, but what might happen next. By the early 1970s, as détente began to reshape the Cold War and arms control negotiations gained momentum, David's expertise contributed to American understanding of Soviet strategic intentions. His assessments helped negotiators identify which limitations the Soviets might accept and which they would resist based on deployment patterns and resource allocation. In 1972, as the SALT I Treaty was being finalized, David provided a comprehensive analysis of Soviet missile deployment patterns that informed the verification protocols. His sequenced approach helped identify what monitoring capabilities would be needed to ensure compliance, what changes in deployment patterns might indicate violations. Throughout these years, David maintained his focus on the methodical, the precise, the carefully reasoned. In an intelligence community sometimes prone to both alarmism and complacency, his analysis provided a steady middle path, identifying genuine concerns without overinflating threats. What stayed with him from those 13 days in October 1962 wasn't a sense of his own importance, but a profound awareness of how fine the line between peace and catastrophe could be. He had seen how easily misunderstanding could cascade toward conflict, how critical it was to understand not just capabilities, but intentions. This perspective shaped his entire career. While others focused on counting missiles or calculating megatonnage, David consistently emphasized understanding the logic behind deployments, what they revealed about Soviet thinking, priorities, and concerns. In October 1982, 20 years after the crisis, David was approaching retirement. The Cold War had evolved through détente and renewed tensions. New missile systems had been deployed. New crises had emerged and been resolved. Through it all, the lessons of October 1962 remained relevant. The importance of clear communication, accurate intelligence, and understanding adversary intentions. David was asked to speak at a classified anniversary symposium examining the enduring lessons of the crisis. Standing before an audience of intelligence professionals and national security officials, he reflected on what those 13 days had taught him. The most dangerous aspect of the missile crisis wasn't the weapons themselves, he said. It was the potential for miscalculation, for each side to misread the other's intentions and set in motion a sequence neither could stop. Our greatest protection wasn't our missiles or our blockade. It was our ability to understand precisely what was happening and what each action might mean. He continued, "Intelligence isn't just about collecting information. It's about creating understanding." During those 13 days, what mattered most wasn't how many missiles the Soviets had deployed. What mattered was understanding their deployment sequence, their operational patterns, their decision timelines. That understanding gave our leaders the time and clarity they needed to find a path through the crisis. The audience listened intently. Many were too young to have experienced the crisis firsthand, but all understood its significance as the closest the world had come to nuclear war. "The lesson I've carried through my career," David concluded, "is that precision matters, not just in counting capabilities, but in understanding patterns of behavior. When dealing with existential risks, approximate understanding isn't good enough. The difference between catastrophe and resolution can be measured in details that many might consider insignificant." After his retirement in 1983, David occasionally consulted on intelligence matters, but largely withdrew from public service. He settled in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he taught a graduate seminar on intelligence analysis at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. His students found him demanding but illuminating. He emphasized what he called sequence thinking, understanding how events unfold over time rather than analyzing static situations. Many of his former students went on to careers in intelligence and diplomacy, carrying his methodical approach into a new generation. In October 1992, as the Cold War receded into history following the collapse of the Soviet Union, David was interviewed for a declassified historical study of the missile crisis. The interviewer, a State Department historian, asked what he considered the most important lesson from those 13 days. "We tend to think of history as driven by grand decisions and dramatic moments," David replied after consideration. "But what I saw in October 1962 was that survival sometimes depends on quiet precision, on understanding exactly where you stand and where the other side stands, on seeing patterns that reveal intentions before they become actions." He continued, "The missile crisis wasn't resolved through bold gestures or overwhelming force. It was resolved through careful, precise navigation of very narrow boundaries. Kennedy needed to respond firmly enough to get the missiles removed, but not so aggressively that Khrushchev felt cornered. Finding that balance required understanding exactly how the situation was evolving, day by day, hour by hour." As the interview concluded, the historian asked David how he wanted history to remember the crisis. His answer was characteristically understated: "As a moment when careful analysis helped prevent catastrophe. Not because one side was stronger or braver, but because both sides ultimately found a way to understand each other, just clearly enough to step back from the brink." By 2002, 40 years after the crisis, most of the key participants had passed away. Documents continued to be declassified, revealing new details about how close the world had come to nuclear war, including the presence of tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba that could have been used against an American invasion, and the Soviet submarine incident where 3 officers argued over whether to launch a nuclear torpedo. These revelations made David's contribution seem even more significant in retrospect. His methodical tracking of deployment sequences had helped provide the time needed for diplomacy to work, preventing actions that might have triggered these previously unknown nuclear threats. In his final public statement about the crisis, given at age 82 at a university symposium marking the 40th anniversary, David reflected on what the experience had meant to him personally. "I've sometimes been asked if I felt the weight of history during those 13 days, he said. "The truth is, I was too focused on the work to think about history. I was just trying to get the analysis right, to understand precisely what was happening with those missiles so our leaders could make informed decisions. He paused, then continued. It was only later that I realized fully what was at stake. Not just geopolitical advantage or national prestige, but the lives of millions, perhaps the future of human civilization itself. And what helped preserve that future wasn't dramatic heroics. It was careful, methodical work by hundreds of people trying to understand exactly where we stood in relation to catastrophe. David Ryder passed away in 2008 at age 88. His obituary in the Boston Globe mentioned his role in the Cuban Missile Crisis only briefly, noting that he had provided crucial intelligence analysis during the October 1962 confrontation. The understatement would have pleased him. At his memorial service, a former colleague who had been in the Situation Room during those 13 days offered perhaps the most fitting tribute. David wasn't the kind of man who sought the spotlight. He didn't make speeches or pound tables. What he did was more important. He helped us see clearly when clarity was what we needed most. In a crisis where miscalculation could have meant the end of everything, his precision helped us find a path through. The true legacy of David Ryder wasn't recorded in history books or commemorated with medals. It lived on in the analytical methods taught to generations of intelligence professionals. The sequenced deployment analysis he pioneered became standard practice, incorporated into how America tracked and understood potential threats around the world. More fundamentally, his approach embodied an essential insight about navigating crises in the nuclear age. That understanding precisely where boundaries lay could be the difference between catastrophe and resolution. In a world where weapons of unprecedented destructive power compressed decision timelines to minutes, approximate understanding was insufficient. Precision wasn't just valuable, it was essential for survival. The Cuban Missile Crisis revealed that even the most dangerous confrontations could be resolved without catastrophe if leaders had the information they needed to understand exactly what was happening and what each action might mean. David's contribution wasn't creating that information, but organizing and interpreting it in ways that revealed not just current status, but likely future developments. What began with a young analyst methodically arranging reconnaissance photographs to reveal deployment sequences became a fundamental approach to understanding strategic threats, not through dramatic insights or bold pronouncements, but through careful, precise analysis that illuminated patterns others might miss. In the decades that followed, as new crises emerged and new threats developed, the approach David pioneered continued to inform how America understood its adversaries. The specific methods evolved with technology, but the core insight remained. Understanding an adversary's sequence of actions revealed intentions that might otherwise remain obscure. David never claimed credit for this legacy. When asked about his contribution in his later years, he typically responded with characteristic understatement. I just tried to see patterns clearly. In a crisis where every hour mattered, understanding exactly what was happening and what might happen next gave our leaders the time they needed to find a peaceful solution. This quiet precision, this commitment to understanding exactly where the boundaries lay between peace and catastrophe, may have been his greatest contribution to a world learning to live with the constant presence of nuclear weapons. Not heroism in the conventional sense, but something perhaps more valuable, the clarity to see a path forward when the stakes couldn't have been higher. In the end, the story of David Ryder and the Cuban Missile Crisis reminds us that history isn't always shaped by dramatic gestures or bold pronouncements. Sometimes it turns on the quiet precision of those who help leaders understand exactly where they stand, and exactly what might happen next. In October 1962, when the world stood at the nuclear brink, that understanding helped guide humanity back from the edge of the abyss. And perhaps that's the most important legacy of those 13 days. The recognition that even at the height of Cold War antagonism, with nuclear missiles aimed at each other's cities, leaders on both sides ultimately chose understanding over miscalculation, precision over approximation, and careful navigation over reckless action. In doing so, they found a narrow path through the most dangerous crisis in human history. A path illuminated, in part, by the methodical work of an analyst named David Ryder, who helped them see clearly when clarity mattered most.